Good morning, everyone. We're so glad that you're joining us. Listen, this morning we did a our gathering time as a congregation via Zoom, which is a little bit different from us. We've been meeting in person and live streaming. And as a result of some pending COVID tests that I still haven't received back from the labs, I may be contagious or maybe not contagious. And so I'm doing fine. I feel like I fully recovered if it was indeed COVID, but we just wanted to take some precautionary measures to make sure that I wasn't going to be getting anybody sick. So we did a Zoom from home. But our plan was to record that Zoom and then sort of release the sermon series or the sermon from our Zoom meeting online. And we didn't get an opportunity to do that. There's something that went wrong with the recording. It was probably my fault. I pushed a button that I wasn't supposed to push to stop the recording. But I did want to make sure that everyone had access to this content for what we talked about because we did start a new series. With the new year approaching, and we had sort of, it's always when the new year comes, everyone or many people choose to set some resolutions or set some goals or hopes or dreams or aspirations for the new year. And so I am the same. I always set hopes and aspirations and resolutions for the new year. I take them very seriously. I have like 6 different categories, and I like sort of think about what am I going to do? And it's a time to reflect. For me, it's a time to reflect on like what's happened in the past year, but also sort of plan and pay attention to where I feel like God's leading me for the next year. So I do this for my personal life, but I also do this for our congregation. And so as I've been in prayer and sort of trying to pay attention to God, where are you leading this congregation? Where are you leading us to move forward? I really sense that sort of our next place as a congregation to move to is I felt like my calling was to create opportunities for our congregation to learn and practice praying. A part of our rule of life is to listen to the Holy Spirit. And that's really just a way to say like, hey, we're in prayer and we're connected to the Holy Spirit. And the reason why I feel like God laid this on my heart is because I think he's been teaching me more and more over the past several years how completely dependent we are on prayer, that if we're not praying, like we're not going to be making it. In fact, when I was reading some material on prayer, one of the authors, Tim Keller, who has a book on prayer, he was talking about, oh, here's what it looks like right here. He kind of gives this thing. He says, listen, imagine that you have an illness that requires medication, that if you don't take it every single day, like if you miss one treatment of this medication, that within hours you will slowly start to die and deteriorate, and you'll be like cut off from the very thing that sustains you and prolongs your life. Like if that was the case, you would never miss a day. You'd be on it. Like you would be taking that medication, you would be carrying it in your pocketbook, like your purse, your pants, whatever the thing is. Like you would not miss it. You set timers and alarms. And if we were to peel back the curtain and look into the spiritual world, that really is exactly what is happening with prayer. When we take for granted this invitation to rest and be reordered in the presence of God, that's what we're doing when we don't do that. And when we do that, it's the wellspring of life. When we engage in that prayer, it makes a huge difference. And so what's interesting is that's what prayer is connected to when it comes to our life. And yet many followers of Jesus really struggle with prayer. We don't really feel comfortable with prayer. We don't know how to pray, or perhaps we know how to pray and we even feel comfortable with it, but we don't make it a priority. We sort of feel like it's boring or it's unfruitful or it's a chore that we have to do that we just would sooner put off as much as possible. And so the question becomes like, gosh, if we are supposed to be these people who are praying because we recognize that our life depends on it, how do we pray? Like, how do we learn to pray? And there have been many times where I have heard people say, oh, you just talk to God. Like, that's how you pray. You just talk to God. And as well-meaning as that response is, I don't actually know that it's super helpful. I think it's real similar to telling a fifth grader who has to write an essay, like, well, just write it. Just write the essay. They have no idea what they're doing. And unfortunately, that's how I was taught to write essays. But what I'm finding is my kids, as they're going through school and learning how to write, they actually like have assistance in learning how to write. They're not told just write the essay like I was. They're given templates. They're given these templates that say first main topic sentence, like write that first, then reason 2, detail 3, detail 4, closing sentence, right? Like they do this whole thing. And so that's how they're taught to write. And the reality is, that's how we can learn to pray. Also, we can be taught to pray the same way by using the templates that are given in scripture to sort of craft our own words, to organize our thoughts and our feelings, and even help us contemplate and work through our own theology. So that's really actually in the Bible. We have an entire book of the Bible that's just a whole bunch of templates to help us understand and coach us and teach us how to pray. And it's the book of Psalms. These are really like David, who writes half the Psalms, really becomes our coach on how to discover God's presence in the good time and the bad, how to take all of our emotions and all that's happening with us and pour it out before a holy God and say like, hey, like, what do we do with this? And bring that before God and allow him to reorder our thoughts and our emotions, all of those things. So my hope with this series that we're going to be engaging in over the next couple of weeks is that we as a congregation, both individually and corporately, will begin to this process of learning how to pray with fruitfulness, with delight, with regularity, and that even after the series is over, that we would, my hope is that we would engage in the Psalms that we've looked at, but also be equipped to dig into more and more Psalms as we discover different Psalms and learn to put them in our own words and use them as templates for prayer. So today, what we're going to be doing in this video, we're going to briefly, like I've sort of condensed the whole sermon into this really summarized sort of thing. We're going to look at Psalm 3 together. We're going to look at the template that's laid out in Psalm 3. So if you want to go ahead and you want to open your Bible, you want to look at the passage along with me, that'd be great. I'll read the Psalm for you also, so you'll kind of know that if it's not right in front of you and you're watching this video, that's fine. But Psalm 3 is a psalm that prays through fear and anxiety, which I think is incredibly relevant for all of us right now. Like, who doesn't have fear and anxiety happening in their lives right now? But it's important that as we read this psalm, as you read any of the psalms, that you recognize how it is that you've learned to deal with emotion. Like in your family of origin, how were you taught to deal with emotion? There are some families that are like smush it all down. Like you just shove it and you stuff it and you pretend you're not feeling everything. Everything's fine. We're all happy. There's no conflict on the surface, right? So you just learn to stuff it down. And then there's other families, like my family of origin, we were loud. If you felt something, you said it, and you said it with power and authority, and it often led to lots of shouting and lots of tears and apologies afterwards because you said something you didn't mean. But the truth is that even though we have this familiarity with one of those ways of dealing with emotion, the Psalms doesn't do either one of those things. It doesn't say, hey, stuff it all down. And it also doesn't say, hey, just air it all out and that's fine. And that's the biggest truth, or put it in the driver's seat and that's the most important. It doesn't allow, it doesn't stuff it, but it also doesn't allow those emotions to take over and put them in the driver's seat. Instead, what we see in the Psalms is we see that the Psalms has us pray through our emotions in the presence of God. To do this process, prayer is actually this process of pouring out all the things that we're wrestling with in the presence of God and just laying it before God and allowing him to reorder it. So in Psalm 3, this is what Psalm 3 is all about. And at the top of Psalm 3, it actually gives us a little bit of context for that psalm. It says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now, this is really helpful when we look at the Psalms because it actually gives us a context for the prayer. The story of this whole thing that's going on when David writes this psalm is actually found in 2 Samuel chapter 15. The context of the story, it happens during the end of David's reign. His son Absalom actually stages a successful coup to kick his father out of the seat of power, to dethrone his father. David and about 100 people that were loyal to him, like, run away from their home. Like, they take off. They have to get out of the capital city as fast as possible. And Absalom, with like 12,000 soldiers, start chasing after him. And David's terrified. He's afraid. There are a lot of unknowns that are about to happen, and he's not sure what's going to happen. But the reality is, with 12,000 guys chasing you, like, things aren't looking good. Like, there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of anxiety. Now, I know that none of us are kingly chieftains of small Middle Eastern nations, but certainly we can all relate to fear of the unknown and the anxiety of what's going to happen and how is this all going to pan out. All of us have had times where it feels like there's a small army mounting against us, ready to kill us. There's this fear of things that surround you, and you look at the odds of coming out unscathed and you think, like, they're not good. They're just not good. And so in Psalm chapter 3, David actually uses a template to pray through this fear, to process through his fear. So we're going to look at Psalm 3. We're going to look at the template that David uses. And the hope is that as we look at this template, that you could take that template and then you could do your own version of that prayer that sort of fits in the template. Remember, same thing as when we teach kids how to write, right? Like, main topic sentence, idea 3, idea 4. If they just copy the template, we're like, no, you didn't write anything, right? So it's not just about copying the template. It's about making sure we understand the template and then putting our own words in the template so that it can express our own thoughts, our own fears, our own anxieties to God and hold them before a holy God, that he might transform us and we might process through that fear and that anxiety. Okay, so verse 1, we're going to look at verse 1. We're going to look through this template. So the first part of the template is what David does is he identifies the source of his emotions. Let's read verse 1 and verse 2. It says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God." So David is like, listen, here's the source of my fear. First, many are my foes, many are rising against me, and many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. There's so many people that want to kill him. There's 12,000 soldiers that are coming after him. And physically, he's terrified. That's the source of his fear and anxiety. But David actually even dives deeper than that. David actually names another source that is unseen. David sort of says, listen, it's not just that people are going to kill me physically. He says, many people are saying about me that there's no salvation for me. AKA, what David's saying is, like, God's done with me, and that's terrifying. He's worried because there's this attack on his self and his identity and his significance and his status. Remember that the whole way that David became king was that he was like the runt of the litter. Like, he was the last one chosen. Nobody cared about David. Nobody thought that he would be chosen. And yet God says, out of his grace and his generosity, he says, I want David. I want David to be king out of no merit of his own. So he protects David, and God blesses David, and he makes a king of his entire nation out of David. And David is a man after God's own heart, and he pursues God wholeheartedly. But eventually, he stops pursuing God, and he starts to use his power and his authority that had been given to him for his own purposes. He sort of sets up his own kingdom instead of pursuing God's, aka the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. It sort of leads him to make some terrible and destructive decisions. He forces himself on another woman. He gets her pregnant, and then to cover it up, he kills her husband and marries her. And slowly, David's world starts to fall apart. His kingdom falls apart. His family falls apart. His own life falls apart. And so verse 2 is this statement that's sort of declaring, like, everybody's saying it. He was chosen, but he's not chosen anymore. God saved him, but God's not saving him anymore. And so David's entire identity is threatened. Yes, there's this physical fear of 12,000 people chasing after him, but also, like, there's this calling into question his identity. Is he still God's king? Is he still on God's side? Does he still have God's heart? See, fear is this interesting thing that causes us to question all the things that we knew before, all the things that we were so certain of. In fact, there's this guy in the 1960s. He was like the foremost thought on fear and anxiety. Anything we know about fear and anxiety, this guy wrote. His name was Rollo May. Um, and he actually talked about how fear and anxiety, that they're two separate things. That fear is often felt in momentary circumstances, right? Circumstances of danger. You have this like fearful response where it heightens your energy, it heightens your senses, it heightens your ability, right? We've all seen those stories of like people lifting cars off of babies in order to rescue their children or something, right? It's sort of like this temporary lightning storm that takes over, often for good purposes, because you need to be afraid. You need to run really fast. You need to do all that stuff. And so there's this physical response of fear to physical circumstances. However, he also talks about how there's this other thing. There's this anxiety. And anxiety is different than fear in that there's not a singular source that happens as a result of it. Anxiety is actually this gloomy haze that just kind of is over everything, and it never really goes away. It's this blur that just lingers and lingers and lingers. And Rollo would say that it renders, what he says is it renders all accomplishments, abilities, relationships completely meaningless. So you may be an Olympic athlete, but if you struggle with anxiety, you are doubting your own abilities. You are doubting your own accomplishments. You're doubting your relationships. You're doubting everything. There's sort of this dread and a weakness and fragility that just like looms over you, and you can't identify the source. In fact, Rollo describes it this way. He says that anxiety is the wear and tear of 1,000 little deaths and disappointments, failures and hardships. Right? It's like year after year after year, you've just experienced all of these failures and all these disappointments and all of these hardships that slowly have worn away and left you questioning your identity and your purpose and your worth. Like, does anybody relate to that? And so what David is talking about is, yes, he is physically afraid of the 12,000 men that are after him and trying to kill him, but also he has this anxiety about these rumors about his identity and his purpose, and they're eating away at him. And what David does in Psalm 3 is he just lays it all out there. Okay, so what I'm going to have you do, if you're following along and you're practicing this new art of praying and you want to learn how to pray through your own fear and anxiety, then what I want you to do is just jot down on a piece of paper, like just find one and jot down like this, or you can do it in the comment section if you want. Jot down the thing that is the source of your fear and your anxiety. What is it? Like, the first thing we do in prayer is we name that thing. So jot that down. And while you're doing that, I'm going to keep going. But David doesn't stop there. David then deals with, after naming his fear and anxiety, he doesn't just let that have the driver's seat. He then shifts his attention to his God. He shifts his attention to God and to truth. In verse 3, he says, "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head," right? He names these three things, these three metaphors that he holds on to as truth. In the middle of his fear, he names these three metaphors. He says, "You're my shield, you're my glory, you're the lifter of my head." And like, if we just think about those three things a little bit, we can begin to understand what David is clinging to. In the middle of this very real fear, he's clinging to these three truths. He's clinging that God is his shield. And again, we don't bring shields in our everyday lives. Like, we don't go to the grocery store and like, let me bring my shield. No, we bring shields when we know we're entering into a dangerous situation. We bring shields to protect the most vital parts of ourselves, our organs, when we expect bad things are going to happen. See, sometimes we have these modern conceptions of God as this idea that, like, if God were real and powerful and loving, he would never let bad things happen to us. And here's the deal, like, you can believe that about God, but don't associate that God with the story of the Bible, the biblical God that we learn about. Because that version of God where he just keeps all the bad things away from you, that doesn't fit into Yahweh. That doesn't fit into the God that we read about in the biblical story. Instead, what we read about is a God that when life does happen, that when the results of sin and brokenness happen that are in this world, that God is with you. that he's a shield protecting the most vital parts of who you are. Now, let this blow your mind. The most vital parts of who you are do not include your physical life here on earth. That when God is our shield, David is declaring, I could die. Like these 12,000 men, these 12,000 soldiers could overtake me. But God is protecting the most vital parts of who I am. That tragedy might strike, but I know that as a result of it, I will be drawn closer to God more than ever before. And so that's the first thing of truth that David holds on to in his prayer. He says, you're my shield. And then he says, you're my glory. Now in Hebrew, this word, my glory, this is the kavod, right? This is this Hebrew word kavod. It means heavy, weightiness, importance. And we know that God has glory, that God is filled with kavod. He's the most important, the most heavy, the most weighty thing that there could be. But the reality is, as humans have glory too. We have importance and we have significance, and we describe and attribute that importance and significance to all sorts of different things. Like we can claim that our kavod is a result of our job or our possessions or our house, our looks, relationship, personalities, all sorts of different things. And those are the things that make us significant and worthy or important. And for David thought that his kavod, his importance, his significance was that he was a powerful king. He was a father of a large family, that he was a successful nation builder, that he had sort of like this moral integrity, that he was a good, upright person. But in this moment, all of that had fallen apart. Like David had just been kicked off his throne in a coup. Absalom killed his other son for raping his sister, David's daughter, right? His whole family was a mess. David wasn't a nation builder anymore, and he certainly didn't have any moral integrity. Like everything that he had put his weight and worth and value and significance in had totally fallen apart. David's kavod in and of himself was gone. And so David comes to God in Psalm 3, and he's like wrestling with this reality of his misplaced kavod, his misplaced meaning, importance, and significance. And now in this moment, he's declaring, God, like everything has been stripped away. Like there is nothing left of me. All I have is you, like you alone. And so you, God, you are my kavod. You are my glory. And with that, this anxiety, we realize this anxiety is sort of the smoke and the symptom of this misplaced kavod. And David airs that and he voices it and then he prays through it. You're my shield. You're my glory. And then the last one, he says, you, God, you lift up my head. Now, we use that sort of phrase in English all the time. We sort of say, like, hold your head up high. It's this understanding of confidence. Be confident. Don't be ashamed. And what David is saying in this prayer is he's saying, I have no confidence in myself. I know I've messed up. I know that I failed. But he has confidence because God, you hold up my head. My confidence is in you alone. Everyone knows that I'm a failure. Everyone knows that I've messed up. But in you, I have confidence. And so in the second part of this prayer that David gives, this template of prayer that David gives, David names the things that he knows to be true about God. And so again, if you're following along, what I want you to do is in the second part on your little piece of paper, go ahead and jot down, fill in the blank for that next template of prayer, right? We've done so far the template of prayer where we name the thing that we're afraid of. We name our fear and anxiety just like David did. And now what you're going to do is you're going to turn your attention to the truth about God that you need to hold on to. So for David, it was, you're my shield, you're my glory, you are, you lift up my head. What is it for you? Like jot that down. We're crafting a prayer right now as we go through Psalm 3. Now, in the next part of this template of how David prays through his fear and anxiety, David names the source of his trust. He names the source of his trust, why he can say, God, you're my shield. God, you're my glory. God, you lift up my head. He names why it is that he can trust this. And so David, yes, is walking out the consequences of these decisions, but he's confident that God is with him. He's failed in so many ways. But he says in verse 4, I cry out to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. David's confidence in God is a result of where he knows God is answering him from. Now, as you're reading through the Psalms, you'll see again and again this phrase, the holy hill, or the holy mountain, or even Zion, right? Like that phrase is used throughout the book of Psalms. And what it references is in Jerusalem, in the highest hill of Jerusalem, was placed the tabernacle. And then after the tabernacle was placed the temple, right? This is the place that was the dwelling place of God. It was the place where they had confidence. David had confidence that God was dwelling and that God was still with him. And why he had that confidence was because he knew that daily and weekly and monthly there were these sacrifices that were being offered, that animals would be taken into the tabernacle and they would be slaughtered and their blood would be poured out to symbolize the covering of the people's sins, their failures, and their brokenness, so that they might remain in the presence of God. It was sort of a symbol that no matter what David had done or where he had gone, he could be confident that God was still dwelling with him because of the sacrifice that had happened and was happening and that would happen. And David existed before the cross, but we live on the other side of the cross. David looks to the tabernacle for these sacrifices, and we have to sort of reframe this phrase of the holy hill or the holy mountain. We don't look to the symbolic sacrifices of the tabernacle. For us, we look to the one true sacrifice that happened on a hill near the holy hill, where another son of David was executed, where Jesus gave his life and died to absorb our sin and our brokenness, whose blood was poured out to cover our sin and our shame, to restore us to wholeness. And then Jesus took on what we deserved. And in the resurrection, he offers new life and confidence through him. So this is what David's praying when he says, I know you hear my cry because I look to you on that holy hill. He's saying, listen, I know that there is a sacrifice that has been made for me so that I can still dwell with God, so that God is still with me. So on your piece of paper, if you're following along and you're using this template of Psalm 3 to craft a prayer, go ahead and jot down in your own words the source of your trust in God. Why do you trust that God is going to be your shield, is going to be your glory, is going to be with you? And then because of that, we're going to keep going to the next part of the template 4. We're going to keep going. David finds rest in verse 5. David moves to the fourth part of his template. It's sort of this part of resting in God and surrender. And David says in verse 5, he says, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me and all around me. Now think about this for a second. When we are overcome with fear and anxiety, how many of us are like, let me go to bed and everything will be better in the morning? No, like we stay up all night and we like toss and turn and we don't know what to do. There's no rest when we have fear and anxiety in us. And here David is. He's named the source of his fear and anxiety. It's real. It's not made up. It's real. And yet, going through this process of turning his attention to God and naming the thing that he trusts in and why he has that trust, David is now able to enter into this place of rest and surrender. He's not afraid anymore. He knows that despite his failures, he can have confidence in God. And he knows that even if he dies, it's not everything's going to be safe. It's even if he dies, he knows that God is protecting the most vital parts of who he is. He can rest and he can surrender. And again, this doesn't mean that all of his emotions and feelings are gone. He still feels them in a really weird way, in a really real way. And we know this because if you go to verse 7, David continues. He says, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you strike my enemies on the cheek and you break the teeth of the wicked. Now, some of us reading that are like, whoa, that's not very nice. Like, David, you're supposed to be this nice guy who's following Jesus. Well, here's the reality. Like, even people following Jesus, like, we have real feelings and real anger. There is actually a lot of language in the Psalms that sort of name a real enemy and are prayers to ask for real justice. The emotion that David gives here is very real and it's very raw. And the feelings and his emotions aren't just shoved down and denied and put to bed. They're poured out in all of their fullness. But David never gives them the driver's seat or says that they're the most true thing, because David then takes all of that things that he's poured out and he turns it over to God and he asks God to take care of his emotions and to take care of the situation. And David finishes his prayer with verse 8. He says, "Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessings be on your people." Wow. Wow. David sort of resigns himself after all of that emotion and all of that very real, raw feelings. David sort of resigns himself and he says, geez, God, if deliverance is going to come, if justice is going to come, if salvation is going to come, it's not going to come from me. It's going to be God. And then he says, and your blessings be on all your people. Right? Like, what a statement of surrender. Now, the crazy thing is that the story in 2 Samuel chapter 15, the story of Absalom trying to overthrow David, it actually resolves in this crazy way. David doesn't lift a finger. Like, David's salvation doesn't come from any action of himself. It comes from God. Like, his surrender was real. And it didn't come because he stuffed it all down. He let it go. And basically what happens is David doesn't lift a finger. Absalom, his son, who's like trying to kill him, he has this really long hair. In fact, he was very vain man, very beautiful man, made all these statues of like how flowing and long his hair was, right? His hair gets caught in a tree in the middle of battle, and it leaves him vulnerable, and somebody like shoves a spear in his chest, right? Like, Absalom meets his doom. But David didn't have anything to do with that. Like, God orchestrated all of that, and however it is that God orchestrates those things. Surrender is so hard, but David is able to do it not by stuffing all of that emotion down, not by denying any fear or anxiety exists, but by going through the process of identifying the source of his emotions, by shifting his attention to God and to truth, by naming the source of his trust, his reason for trusting God, and then resting in God and just totally surrendering to him. David is able to vent the fullness of his emotions without giving them control. He's able to process the root of his belief system about God that then allows him to cope with the situation and then hand it over to God. And so if you've been following along and you've been writing your own prayer based on the template of Psalm 3, I'll invite you now to just go ahead and jot down like your statement and declaration of rest and surrender. Like, not fake, like not trite, not contrived, but God, I'm going to try to sleep tonight. God, I'm going to try to put down my phone and stop the doom scrolling. God, I'm going to trust that you are taking care of this. In the psalm, we are invited to be on the same journey that David is, to name the source of our fear and our anxiety, whether it's this lightning storm that's physical and happening now, or it's this anxiety attack of gray clouds that just always seem present. And we're invited to dig deep, because some of the reason for this fear and anxiety may be our own misplaced glory, that we've placed our own worth and our value and our significance on the wrong thing. And there's going to come a time, whether in tragedy or the 1,000 little deaths and disappointments and failures, where all of a sudden everything we've placed our worth and our value on has just started to unravel and fall apart. And in that moment, we have this opportunity to replace that glory on the right things, to recognize that God is the one who gives us our worth and our significance and our value. And so that's Psalm 3. I invite you to use Psalm 3 as a template for your own prayer life, to use Psalm 3 as a way of sort of ordering your, walking through your own fears and anxiety and naming them in the presence of God and allowing you to walk that process of trusting in God and recognizing that He is your rest and surrendering to Him. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at another psalm. We'll be doing our normal live feed and joining in the building on purpose in Clarksburg Church in the building. And so, if you wanted to join us either on live stream or in the building, we'd love to have you. Our service is at 10 a.m. And you can join us there. All right. May God be with you.